roses were living the dream.
To you, my darling.
No, to you.
Until it all came crashing down.
You got fired.
Fired?
On August 29th, stop.
You stop!
And see The Roses. Rated R. In theaters everywhere, August 29th.
Tired of losing your sanity looking for important work? Dropbox Dash finds what you need fast across all your work apps so you can focus on what matters. Dash means less time searching, more time creating. Learn more at dropbox.com/dash.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Anand Padian, a professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of Something Between Us, The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down, which we'll be discussing today. Anand Padian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
You know, I've read, I don't know how many books about polarization at this point. There are a lot of them, right? You could practically fill a whole bookstore. But what I like about yours, I felt like it's at least somewhat unique and valuable for that reason, because I think it looks at polarization in a way that most of these books out there don't. I mean, not just in terms of our media consumption, but in terms of our built environment, our homes, our vehicles, even our bodies. And so I guess my first question is, wow, that's a really different structure. How did you come up with that?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. And honestly, more generally, for your interest in the project. I am not a political scientist. I am an anthropologist. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And though this is very much a book about our contemporary social and political situation here in the United States, I come at it from the specific standpoint of my discipline, which is an academic discipline that focuses on the everyday life of people in different circumstances around the world, their habits, their beliefs, their practices, the way that they relate to other people in those societies, the imagination people in a particular society have about the right way to live, and the ways in which those imaginations are anchored in the specific circumstances of their lives, their material culture, and all the other things that come together to give us a cultural or social milieu to live in. And it's that kind of attention that I direct toward this situation that we have here in the United States, this thing that we've been calling polarization, the evident reality that people who have different political commitments in this country, who belong to different parties, who sit on different places along the ideological spectrum, have so much difficulty not only in talking to each other now, but even in making sense of where that other person is coming from, given the starkly different pictures of reality itself that these different political positions seem to be anchored in. And so thinking about this challenge as an anthropologist, trying to make sense of it, my instinct was very much to look at the circumstances in which people live. And in particular, when I started on this journey in 2016 and thought most especially about the idea of the border wall and the idea of an impenetrable concrete barrier between the United States and Mexico, which in many ways was the central idea of the Trump campaign that year, and really maybe even the idea that catapulted him for the first time into the White House, I was struck immediately and in the months that followed by the extent to which that notion of a wall, a necessary wall between our country and others beyond, seemed to resonate, echo, reduplicate everyday walls and divides and borders, if we can even use that term, that Americans had come to live with and take for granted in their daily lives with regard to their homes, their automobiles, even their own bodies and minds. And that's, in a sense, what I try to show through the course of this book.
Very early in the book, there are so many striking lines, but one that really caught me early on is you write, distance is what makes such conspiratorial thinking possible. I never really thought about a connection between those two things. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit so listeners get a sense of how you see these things, this physical distance and this conspiratorial thinking, how you see them as being related.
Well, so much of the conspiratorial thinking that we see now in the United States and really all over the world has to do with fears and anxieties, concerns that people have about others elsewhere, others unlike them, others whose commitments and lives may be different from our own. And so at some level, I would say conspiratorial thinking is anchored very basically in a kind of imagination of oneself and one's own life and what one sees in the here and now and what might be happening out of sight somewhere else, what others unseen may be doing in a way that may have an impact on us, but which we can't reach directly, which is why we tend to resort to rumors, to speculations, to an imagination of what might be happening, which is really the texture of any conspiracy. And the basic argument that I'm trying to make in this book is that if we're concerned about this distinction between self and other, we can't just think about it in abstract terms. We can't just think about it in social terms or the terms of race or the terms of politics, this people and that people, this people who believe this and people who believe that. We have to really look at how those differences are anchored in our lives. And again, what I try to show in this book is that the basic distinction between self and other becomes magnified, deepened, even radicalized when people begin to live in circumstances of deeper and deeper isolation, of greater and greater distance from others. And under those circumstances, I think it's natural at some level to begin to imagine what people beyond those bubbles and cocoons might be doing, and perhaps even to worry about them. And so these patterns of distancing, I think, do have a great deal to do with the rise of that kind of conspiratorial thinking.
One of the things I really loved about the book is that in so many works written by academics, they tend to be dry and dull and very theoretical. And certainly you have theory in there, but you talk to a lot of people for a lot of years. And it gives this book a richness that so many other books, at least I feel, don't have. For instance, one of the places you visited was there was this gun show where there was a rep for something called Thunderwear, which is this, I guess, some sort of a concealed carry system for handguns. Told you that people buy their product because it's a comfortable way to sleep with a handgun. I actually had to read that twice. I remember the first time, it's like, it just seems so bizarre to me. I'm like, I guess maybe I'm not very, very well in touch with kind of the fears, the concerns of a certain segment of Americans, but that just kind of blew my mind a little bit. And I'm wondering, I heard that secondhand. You heard a lot of stories like this. And I'm wondering, was this an eye-opening experience for you as well, or did you expect a lot of this?
Well, I am quite candid in the book, and I'll be candid in this conversation as well, that a lot of the motivation for doing work like this for me was coming to the realization that I lived in bubbles of my own. My social circles, my conversational circles had also contracted over the year. And I was largely in the company of people who thought many things that I did, who had very similar political commitments. And so this book does grow out of a personal commitment to move beyond the circles of familiarity that I, like many others, had taken for granted, and that had, in a way, reduced people who have, say, more conservative beliefs, who feel very strongly about the Second Amendment and gun rights, people who have other kinds of ideas about what the country needs, what their place is in it, what they need themselves as people within this large and complex polity of ours. I had all kinds of presuppositions that I needed to break down and to think about in a more open-minded manner. And so the effort, again, as an anthropologist, was to reach out to folks, to travel around the country. I wound up doing field work in more than a dozen states, in different parts of the United States, going to places like that gun show in Florida that you mentioned, but all kinds of other places, talking to people at builders conventions, at car dealerships, in cafes, on park benches, in all kinds of circumstances, listening for what's important to them, what they take seriously, but also doing it ultimately with a commitment to putting what I learned in the form of stories. I think it's really easy for us to resort to judgments about what others believe and the problems that ensue when those beliefs gain a certain kind of power or traction. It's easy to make assumptions about why people believe what they believe. It's easy to dismiss things that other people believe when we disagree with them or they don't sit well with the things that we believe ourselves. But that's not going to help us understand why those other positions have the support they do, why they have the traction they do, and ultimately why these impasses of ours are as deep and challenging as they are. So as a matter of method, what I try to do is to pursue these kinds of encounters, put myself in places that I didn't expect to be, like that gun show. We don't have any firearms at our home. It's not a commitment that's really, that sits very well with our perception of our place in the world as a household. But I wanted to go to places like that to try to understand what leads people to them. And in going to that gun show in particular, finding that, not only were people interested in all kinds of firearms, big and small, but that there was such a market for concealed carry that people were innovating by suggesting all kinds of ways of wearing your gun in the most unexpected situations and circumstances, to the point of even sleeping with a firearm. This was a real eye-opener for me, and it was worthy of a story. And my hope with stories like that is that we begin to try to imagine what the world might look like from the standpoint of those who have those ideas, who make those commitments, who find those possibilities meaningful. We may not ultimately agree with those ideas ourselves, but I think it's really important to get a sense of where they come from.
One of the things you focus on in the book is what you call fortress homes. And when I heard that, I got this vision of this huge, McMansion sort of thing with a big gate around it and security systems and cameras everywhere and all that. And certainly I object to them on aesthetic grounds, but you're looking at it in a different way. Obviously, the thing that separates people. And one of the things you write about these fortress homes is you say they provide an illusion of peace and security. And when I read that, I thought, well, okay, I think I see what you're getting at. But I think a lot of people would say, well, these actually provide real peace and security. I mean, if you have triple pane windows, you're going to hear less of the outside. And if you have walls and dogs and alarms and all that, well, that's going to probably make you less likely to be broken into. And I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, that's what I want. I want a big, solid, secure house to keep all the dangerous world at bay, at least as much of it as I possibly can. And so what's wrong with it? Maybe it's wrong is the wrong word to use here, but there's a certain thinking behind this, I guess, that you get at when you're talking about fortress homes. So I was hoping you could expand on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Let me just begin by saying that safety is really important. A sense of security is really important. A sense of well-being that one has about one's place in the world, one's immediate environment, surroundings. All of these things are really important. There are a lot of people who live with a great deal of insecurity, a great deal of uncertainty around their circumstances, their environments, whether or not they can safely move around in the world. And these sentiments are important. It's important that we take them seriously. It's important that we validate those concerns. But the desire for safety and security and the means by which we try to secure it, these things can be expressed in very different ways. They can be embodied in very different kinds of strategies. And one of the larger arguments that I make in this book is that ultimately we all stand to be much better off as a country, but also as residents of a planet that is facing all kinds of collective perils at the largest of scales and at smaller scales in all kinds of ways. We'll all be better off. We'll all be, we'll have the greatest chance of flourishing if we can think about our safety and security in more collective terms. If we can take more seriously the underlying reality that the well-being of any of us is necessarily bound up with the well-being of others beyond the immediate span of our families and our own lives. Martin Luther King spoke eloquently about this in his letter from a Birmingham jail when he spoke about a web of interconnection about a web of interconnection. All of us were caught up in a web of mutuality. And it's difficult enough to imagine that, but it becomes even more difficult to take ideas like that seriously when our everyday circumstances wind up being situations of bunkering, of radical retreat, of separating ourselves in the name of protecting ourselves. And we see this very much with regard to homes in this country. Homes are getting larger, as you mentioned, and that's one thing, but they're also becoming securitized in ways that they haven't been before. There's a ubiquity of home security technologies of all kinds that we see now in the construction of new homes. 1 in 5 Americans who lives in a residential community lives in a community that's secured now by gates or fences. There are all kinds of ways in which preoccupations with being safe have really come to shape the construction and design of our homes in this country. And of course, one could say, what's wrong with that, right? Don't we need that? Isn't that something that we all need and deserve? But when you begin to pay attention to some of these dynamics, as I did for this research, when you look at how they're marketed, when you look at how they're organized, when you look at the experience of people living in some of these circumstances, what you find is that paradoxically, the press for ever more security and safety at an individual level can actually make people feel more unsafe because there is ultimately no way of isolating yourself completely from the larger society, the larger environment. And the more invested you are in the idea that the safest place is the one behind those triple pane windows and all that blockage, the more uncertain you're going to feel about having to go out of a space like that to do the other things that you need to do as a member of a society. And so paradoxically, a lot of these measures tend to produce more uncertainty. I spoke about this in the book in the context of a gated community that I visited in Florida and conversations I had with the security manager in this community who actually spoke to this precise point about the sense of paranoia that he discerned in so many of the residents, their need for reassurance constantly that things were going to be okay. I think we have to ask ourselves, is this the best way of protecting ourselves, of securing ourselves and our loved ones, or are there in fact ways that we can rebuild a more collective dimension to this desire for well-being?
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
I want to ask you about porches. Now, that's a sentence I never thought I utter on this podcast, but it's important, I think. I've always been a huge fan of like a big wraparound front porch. I remember the first time I saw a picture of Teddy Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, so he's my favorite president. It's like, I love that idea. But when I look at new homes, that big wraparound, expansive front porch, it's not really a thing so much. You can see it in older construction, but not really in newer homes. And you make the case that that is not an insignificant or not just some kind of weird architectural quirk, but that actually has a certain meaning, right?
Absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, because recently I was speaking about this book with a journalist based here in Baltimore who had grown up in Kansas City and had grown up with stories of Harry S. Truman coming back to Kansas City after his term had ended as president and sitting out on his front porch, apparently, and just greeting people.
Wow.
As they who could say things to him, apparently, right? This is what the journalist told me, right? So I'm reporting this to you second or third hand. But imagine, right? Imagine a former president sitting on their front porch, just greeting people as they walk by. Hello, Mr. President. Hello, Mr. President.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And look at where we are now. The porch is an absolutely fundamental space of American social and cultural life. There are classic and essential works of American literature, such as some of Mark Twain's work, that, as we know from the historical scholarship, were composed or which grew out of porchfront conversations. Porches are an iconic symbol of our social lives, and yet, as you point out, sadly, they've become largely ornamental for so many people. Homes might still be built with them, but they're more like symbols than they are actual spaces of social life. This has to do with different things that have happened over the years. It has to do in part with the rise of air conditioning and the retreat into climate-controlled space that we see in this country and many others. It has to do with the rise of the automobile, the dust, and so on that it could kick up, especially in the early years of automobile-led suburban development. But it also, in more recent years, has to do with something that I encountered as an observation in many different places around the country where I traveled for this book, which is the observation that people have made that increasingly, when people do socialize outdoors with friends, they are doing it not on their front porches, but instead on their back decks. That is to say, not in a space of more open and unrestricted social engagement with your neighbors, perhaps with your friends, but certainly also with strangers and others who are passing by, but instead solely in the company of those you know, those who are invited in. And that has consequences, because we need to know how to interact with strangers. We need to know what it's like to share our social worlds with people we don't know. So much of the xenophobic discourse that we encounter in our contemporary politics in this country has to do with a fear of foreigners and strangers and what they might be up to. But the argument I'm making in this book is that fears and concerns of that kind are magnified by just the declining circumstances that we have for actually engaging with strangers on a day-to-day basis.
And it's not just our homes that have become fortresses. You move on to talk about vehicles. And when I read about this, I thought back to a couple of years ago. My wife and I were thinking about maybe relocating to Italy or France. And so we went there not as tourists, but as like potential home buyers. And one of the things I noticed, I was really struck by it, is there were almost no big pickup trucks on the roads in Italy or France and in Rome and southern France where we were. And I mean, here in the U.S., it's like something around, I think, 80% of new vehicle sales are trucks and SUVs. And that's like somewhere around a 27% increase in the last couple decades. And so all of a sudden, especially in the U.S. here, the roads are just dominated by these big hulking things. What do you think? What's going on here?
It's such an important question. It is absolutely the case that the American automotive market has been almost completely taken over by these massive vehicles, to the point where production lines all around the country that used to make smaller cars have in recent years been retooled to make SUVs and trucks. It's something that I encountered or tried to make sense of in conversation with automotive designers, with car dealers, with consumers in some cases, like trying to understand the appeal of these larger vehicles. And it's and though there are many different things that underlie the purchase of an automobile that or motivate the purchase of a car, like the purchase of anything, it does seem to be the case that for many American consumers, the idea that these larger vehicles are safe has a certain power. Like the notion that if you're on the road and you might potentially get into an accident or some kind of difficult situation, that you want to be in the larger vehicle so that you can ensure that your people are protected. That is a sentiment that's out there. And it speaks to this larger sense, this more antagonistic sense of securing oneself, perhaps at the expense of others, that I try to wrestle with in this book. Because the problem when people move collectively in that direction, when our automakers are moving us as well by encouraging us to move in that direction, the problem is, again, that not everyone can be in a vehicle that big. Not everyone can afford such a vehicle. Not everyone can afford a vehicle to begin with. And no matter what, there are always going to be people using our roadways in other ways. We are always going to have walkers. We are always going to have cyclists. We are always going to have children playing by the side of the road or walking to school. There are always going to be more vulnerable road users among us. And the tragic nature of this development that we've been talking about is that these larger vehicles are much more dangerous to people who are occupying those roadways in a more vulnerable manner. And pedestrian fatalities, for example, in this country have increased by 50% over the last decade. It's not just because of the size of the vehicles. There are other kinds of factors that are also at stake here, but certainly the size and shape of these vehicles has something to do with it. I can tell you just a few days ago, I was driving my daughter to a summer art camp that she was attending last week. We live in the city of Baltimore, and we have a pretty small car. We have a Honda Fit. It's a car that's no longer produced in the United States because the market has bottomed out for cars that small in the United States. So we're hanging on to it for as long as we can. We turn the corner from our little street in the city, and there's a massive truck coming at us down this narrow street around the corner from our house. It's so much higher than our car. It's so much wider than our car. And there was no way we could pass each other. So we had to back all the way out of that street just to let this vehicle pass. And I don't know. What are we doing? There are a lot of these vehicles are just so out of proportion to the human scale of things. And I find it a really troubling development.
Yeah. To me, it's not just necessarily the size of these vehicles that's at least in part responsible for issues for walkers and cyclists. I used to be a cyclist for for decades, actually. But not too long after we moved to Cincinnati, I actually ended up selling my bike because whenever I went out, my wife, Kimberly, was just so worried that I would get hit. And it wasn't a crazy, irrational worry, because I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, a guy I was at a book club with, totally normal, nice, intelligent guy. And somehow bicycles came up and he said, yeah, I hate them. Whenever I'm on the road and I see one, I kind of sort of try to swerve into him a little bit to run him off the road. I was stunned. It's like, just put a scare into him, he said. I was like, huh? And it seems to me that now this guy might be extreme, but it does seem to me that much of the U.S. is not at all cyclist or pedestrian friendly and sometimes downright antagonistic. And I'm wondering, is that this part of the same sort of thing? Like, how dare you invade my road with your dinky little Schwinn or whatever it is,
Yeah, well, okay. First of all, that's really Trump.
Yeah, you think?
And I don't know if you followed up and if he said anything more, but as a former, say, enthusiast for road biking myself, who wound up giving it up largely because of how unsafe I began to feel with these ever-greater vehicles and just knowing accidents happen and having been in a couple myself. Yeah, I feel for the cyclists in such a place. It's really important that we take seriously the needs that different people have in the spaces we share. In recent years, ideas like complete streets, ideas about, say, building roads that accommodate not only vehicles but also cyclists and pedestrians, and are built out not only with lanes for automotive traffic but also for bicyclists and also sidewalks. And all these kinds of ideas have gained some momentum. They did gain a little more momentum, especially in the years of the pandemic, when people were walking a lot more in their own neighborhoods. And I think thinking about these questions in ways that they hadn't thought as much before. And I think those developments do give me hope. But the dynamic that you're speaking about, I think for me, as someone studying this and someone trying to make sense of it in the context of this book, I think just has to do with maybe a larger difficulty we're having in this country right now about imagining and taking seriously the possibility that different kinds of people can in fact share space side by side with each other. People of different faiths, people of different racial backgrounds, people who speak different languages, or indeed people in cars side by side with people walking and doing other things. What is it about our culture now that makes us so suspicious about the very possibility that people of different kinds, or people moving through the world in different ways, can actually coexist with each other side by side? It speaks to these larger patterns that I try to get at in the book, the deepening of these lines between those on the inside and those on the outside, and the increasing difficulty we seem to be having in taking the welfare of those on the outside as seriously as we need to take it.
Yeah. And, I guess it's one thing to be suspicious of outsiders from in your fortress, but then it can go over into actually being outright antagonistic. I mentioned the example of that guy I knew, but in the book, you talk about something I'd forgotten all about, that this was a thing, and maybe some listeners aren't familiar, but the practice of what's called rolling coal. Can you talk about what that is? It's just such a weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's both weird and unweird. Like, I think so much of what I try to talk about in the book, the book is really about, in some ways, the weirdness of what we've come to take for granted, or what we've come to accept as normal. And this is maybe one of the more extreme examples of that, but I'll come around to talking about why I don't find it that unusual, why we ought to be careful about treating it as such an outlier. the phenomenon of coal rolling is something that gained some notoriety beginning about a decade or so ago. It involves people with diesel trucks retrofitting those vehicles in such a manner that allows them to flood their engines with excess fuel that escapes uncombusted or partially combusted in the form of thick clouds of black smoke. It's a sort of countercultural expression of a fondness for the power of these vehicles, but also in some cases, the polluting nature of these vehicles. It first burst into prominence in this country in the name of Prius repellent. You'd hear stories about people smoking out others driving a Prius or an electric car with a gesture like this as a way of expressing their disdain. Or again, people walking or biking. You see all kinds of videos of this kind online. In more recent years, in 2020, for example, when we had Black Lives Matter protests in so many places around the country, there were people doing this to protesters on the street, driving by and dousing them with big clouds of black smoke, again, as a way of expressing their disagreement with those ideas. And, it isn't something that many people do. It isn't something that happens everywhere. It isn't something that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. But when we stop and think about the rolling back of fuel economy standards in this country, when we stop and think about the fact that the EPA might be on the verge now of backing away from the position that climate change poses serious health consequences for people and that it ought to be treated, that fossil fuels ought to be treated as pollutants. When we see the ways in which we're returning this country to a kind of celebration of fossil fuel consumption in its most unbridled forms, I do begin to wonder whether, I don't know, we're all being coal rolled at some level, maybe in more figurative terms.
After that, you move on to, you talk about homes, our vehicles, and then you move on to our bodies. And in that section of the book, the first chapter the title is White Body Armor. I was hoping you could talk about the significance of that title.
Yeah, that's a chapter that took me to Shelbyville, Tennessee, to the site of the first white nationalist rally in the United States after the infamous rally in Charlottesville that left so many people injured and one protester dead. I wanted to understand the appeal of this politics. I wanted to understand why it was that some people at least in this country, have come to feel so strongly that people of different races can't, in fact, share a country. And I spent a day actually in the company of white nationalists who had come to that town to participate in this White Lives Matter rally, a rally that was meant to defend the idea or put forward the idea of breaking the United States up into a series of different ethno-states where every different race or ethnicity had its own country. And so what I was trying to make sense of is just the appeal of an idea like that and what it might have to do with larger ideas in our country about our bodies and about our bodily well-being and about the sense of vulnerability that people often have, again, in proximity with others unlike them. And so though I'm focusing in particular on white nationalist politics in that chapter, I'm also thinking a little about sort of wider cultures of body armor in this country and the extent to which the imagination of an armored body might, say, reflect a kind of militarization of everyday American culture, but also, once again, maybe a starker sense of the division between oneself and other, and the sense as well that to truly be safe in the company of others, one has to isolate and separate and protect oneself.
And after that, you move to what you call the walls of the mind. And this is the section of the book where we get into your, I guess I'll call him your former friend. I think that's the term I should use, your former friend, Frank. And I'll let you tell this story because there's so much here. I wouldn't know where to begin. But can you talk about how your relationship with Frank unfolded and what you learned about these walls of the mind from it?
Yeah. So again, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, what I really did try to do with this book is to strike up conversations and sometimes relationships with people whose convictions were very different from mine. I met people all over the country and sometimes stayed in touch with them for quite a while. I'm still in touch with many of the people who are central characters in the book. And one of the things that's actually been really interesting in keeping in touch with people over these years in particular, say between 2016 and 2025, is seeing how much many people have changed their own minds about their political identity, about the ideas of those in power, about whether or not the two major political parties in the country truly constitute adequate homes for them and for the range of political sentiments we have in this country. It's been really interesting to see people that I know who started out as, say, for example, diehard Republicans express a sense of political homelessness that they feel now with the rise of a kind of MAGA Republicanism that, I track a little and I talk about a little in the book. But there are other folks, who changed as well, but maybe in the opposite way, who kind of just got a little kind of dug into positions that they had held before. And this person that I call Frank, I would say is one of those folks, someone that I met at a at a libertarian festival in Las Vegas in the summer of 2017. Someone with whom it was clear from the very beginning that I had very little in common. He was a small businessman from a town in southern Michigan. I'm a university professor from the city on the East Coast. We had very different political beliefs, but somehow we we sat next to each other at one of these sessions and we just started talking and we started arguing. And it was clear that we were both really enjoying all these arguments and we kept it up. I visited him later that summer in his town in southern Michigan. He visited me the following year in Baltimore. We kept in touch for several years through the pandemic. Through much of the pandemic, through the 2020 presidential election. And eventually we got to a point where we couldn't remain in touch. And I talk about that in that book. But a lot of it actually just had to do with the impossibility ultimately of seeing eye to eye. There was no space for compromise. There was no space for mutual understanding. It was so stark, the differences between our ideas. And so with a situation like that, my effort in the book isn't to somehow try to bridge the divide, to somehow try to find common ground, to somehow try to find a point of compromise where we can both agree, but instead just try to make sense of why agreement just seems to be so deeply impossible or implausible, and at least try to be as precise as I can about those points of blockage and impossibility, and to try to think about what we can learn from such instances where conversation just winds up at an impasse.
Yeah. I remember there's one point in the book where you and Frank are talking about COVID and you talk about how people are playing Russian roulettes with their lives, right, in the name of freedom and their neighbors from not getting vaccinated and so forth. And Frank responded, "Freedom is more important to me." And I read that and I thought, well, where can you go from there? It's just like, boom, that's that's a big old wall there.
It's really hard. And that was something that point in the book was a moment of personal pain for me. A lot of this book, just to step back for a moment, grows out of moments of personal pain. I have to say, my family immigrated to the United States from India. My parents immigrated to the United States from India in the 1970s. My sister and brother and I were all born here. We grew up here. We have, I think, always taken for granted that we have a place in this country. There was a real sense, though, in 2016 that place was in question in a way that it hadn't been for so much of our lives. And this had consequences for us, for our family members, even for, my own children and their everyday life in ways, again, that I talk about in this book. So these things that we're talking about here have affected me personally. And in that particular case that you write about, that you spoke about a second ago, it was an instance where Frank had been talking about going to bars in northern Indiana and being unmasked in the company of so many other unmasked people, and just talking about how free it felt. And I couldn't help but just think about the fact that my father had just told me about, again, an Indian American college classmate of his who lived in northern Indiana, caught COVID from one of his patients and died of the COVID he caught from one of his patients in northern Indiana just before we had this conversation, just before, he was celebrating this freedom. And I felt it. I felt really forcefully this tension between the freedom that some enjoy and the devastating consequences that can have for others. There's always been an underside to freedom in this country. It comes home to us in all kinds of ways. And I think that we have to bear witness to that. We have to think of freedom in more complex terms. We have to think about what freedom could look like if we take the well-being of everyone we share this society with equally seriously.
Well, let's move on to the path forward, or a possible path forward. You talk about conviviality and mutual aid or caretaking. And I want to start with conviviality because I wasn't expecting that term. And I would guess that most people hearing that would think, oh, that just means someone at a party who's loud and, hey, how you doing? All that sort of thing. But it's more than that, at least in my read of your understanding of that term. And so I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what conviviality means to you and why you think it's important.
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I'm really lucky to live in a neighborhood that has a great deal of conviviality, where people engage each other on a daily basis, where people acknowledge each other on a daily basis, even people they don't know. There's a kind of neighborliness that I think anchors so much of the way that people relate to each other on a day-to-day basis on the streets of our neighborhood. I think just this morning before our conversation, I had brief exchanges with maybe 4 or 5 neighbors, just sort of coming in and out of the house at different moments. This can still happen. It's really important that there are places that it still happens. It's sad that it isn't happening as much for so many Americans in so many places. And I'm thinking a lot about what it would take to bring some of that back into focus. And I do think that creating circumstances in which people can engage in more of that give and take with others they live alongside can learn to sort of just navigate what it means to live in the company of others, to see not only the value of those joyful moments where you enjoy each other's company, which is, I think, typically the way that we think of conviviality, but also the possibility of finding some kind of mutual accommodation, finding those compromises, finding a way to live with each other, even in the face of conflict, of misunderstanding, of tension, of the problems that arise. Conviviality to me speaks to that whole range of possibilities. And ultimately, if we are as a country to find our way back to a place where we can sustain this imagination of people of different kinds living side by side with each other, there are skills here that we need to develop once again, that we need to deepen, that we need to practice in order to ensure that we can live with all those differences effectively.
And the other part of that then is mutual aid or caretaking. And when I thought about this, I guess I thought about, it's going to sound weird. I thought about your story at Ant Flow, which is this little company that was founded to help provide period products for women in public bathrooms. And there's a connection here. I'll let you make it. At least I think there's a connection here, right? Because this seems to me to embody the sort of caretaking, mutual aid sort of effort that we could very much benefit from having more of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to take a step back for a moment before we get to that particular story, the argument that I make in the book is that as isolating as many of these circumstances may be, as painful as the consequences of all this isolation can be, and I try to narrate that in all kinds of ways through the stories that I present, I'm also arguing that we still have resources at our disposal with which to nurture, sustain, and deepen a different kind of collective life. And a lot of those resources have to do with the lessons that we can draw from those who have continued to organize for other forms of social justice that take seriously the possibility of attending to safety, security, and well-being in more collective terms. People fighting for racial justice, for environmental justice, for clean water, for safe roads, and indeed for different forms of gender justice, among which I think one issue is this question of menstrual inequity, or the basic fact that people who menstruate very often find themselves in situations where they are in places where they don't have what they need to deal with a basic biological reality that is there for half of our population. And the simple question that activists who work on this issue ask is, if we have toilet paper for free in every public bathroom, why can't we count on the same when it comes to menstrual products, right? It's such a reasonable question, and yet a difficult struggle, but one that has found some success. And in that chapter, I look at the way in which activists working on this issue made real headway with regard to addressing these problems of menstrual inequity in the state of Ohio, a conservative state led by conservative lawmakers, in the same years that reproductive rights were rolled back. And I'm thinking about why it was that they were able to find some success on this issue in that time. And I look at how people working, young people in particular, young women in particular, working in this movement were able to catalyze coalitions between Democratic and Republican lawmakers, getting them to come together to commit to addressing this issue in a meaningful way. And that is just one of many examples of unexpected coalitions, unexpected alliances, allegiances that I chart in the book that I think do give us a sense of promise and a way forward. It's something that we can think of at that larger scale of social movements. It's something that we can think of at a smaller everyday scale in terms of who we're willing to talk to, who we're willing to listen to, what we're willing to stop and consider as another way of being in the world. I think modeling that kind of receptivity is something that we could all think about as well.
And, what really struck me about that particular story is that so much when we think about the problems of the world and isolation and hatred, it all feels so abstract and overwhelming. And like, I know the coral reefs are dying and the climate's changing and I don't know what to do, but this is like here's a specific problem that people are dealing with that we can actually do something about, that makes them better, that I would argue makes us better and makes society better, even aside from the benefits of these of women having these menstrual products. It's like a win-win. I don't know, win-win-win. I don't know, but I guess that's what made me feel hopeful about that story. And I got to say, I appreciated that because honestly, I'm kind of pessimistic just because it seems to me there are so many forces in modern American society that want to keep us bunkered up, that want to keep us secure, that want to get us to buy more stuff to secure ourselves and to have bigger and better fortresses. Yet I want to feel optimistic. And so you've been thinking about this, like you said, since 2016 in a serious way. But when you look around, what do you see that maybe helps you feel at least somewhat optimistic about where we're at or where we might be at some point in the near-term future?
It's such an important question. And I have to admit to you that there are days when I feel more energized and optimistic.
Yeah, sure.
When I feel terrible. There are terrible, terrible things happening right now in so many parts of the world, in so many parts of this country. And it's really difficult sometimes to kind of think about how it is that we can carry on with our ordinary lives when so many people are suffering needlessly. And I don't know. It's hard. It's hard. I will say that if there's anything about engaging in this research over these last years that leaves me hopeful, it's just realizing that people are ultimately so often more complicated than we give them credit for. You might think you know someone because of who they voted for or how they identified politically or what kind of person they are or what they look like. And yet time and again, we find that things just don't line up. People surprise us. You'd think that they'd be completely hostile to someone like me wandering into a town. And yet, like time and again, I was met with a great deal of friendliness, I have to say. Even at the same time that all of these incredibly toxic and hostile discourses, frankly, sometimes about people like me, are in the air. So what do you do with that? What do you do with attention like that? It doesn't excuse the hostility, the violence, the needless suffering that's imposed on others. It doesn't make that go away, and it doesn't make that okay. But it still is a reminder that it is ultimately human beings that are engaged in all these decisions, politics, outcomes, that there are people living through these challenges. And if we can find a way to lean into the kinds of relationships that can make for more open-minded engagement and thinking with the travails of others, then we may ultimately get somewhere. I think that every one of the most hopeful stories in this book grows out of situations where people leaned into relationships with others unlike them and found themselves with commitments or priorities they didn't have until those commitments and priorities became important, manifested as important through those relationships. So I really do think that so much turns on that question of how we keep those lines open.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking with you today. So thanks very much. Like I said, it's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. Again, the Something Between Us, the Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. Definitely check it out. And Anand Pandian, it's been great talking with you today.
It's been so good talking to you as well. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,